Hello everybody, let's continue with the hemodynamics, and this is for the arterial hemodynamics. Before we start, I'd like you guys to check out the basics of the hemodynamics, a previous video for the basics of hemodynamics before you start with the arterial one. An idea of the arterial tree in our body, it starts with the heart, the left ventricle, and then it goes to the aorta and big arteries and the medium arteries, small arteries, and then the arterioles. Arterioles are the very terminal end of the arterial tree. So as the arteries are going on these steps, they go smaller and smaller and smaller. So arterioles obviously are the smallest of these branches of the arterial tree. And then it ends by the capillaries. Capillaries then will collect back into venules and then small veins, medium veins, and then the superior and inferior vena cava, and which are the big veins, and then go to the heart in the right atrium. So it starts in the left ventricle of the heart and ends in the right atrium of the heart. There is another circulation, which is the pulmonary circulation, which starts in the right ventricle and it ends in the left atrium. So this is another thing. We are not discussing this at this moment. So to start with the arterial hemodynamics, we need to know what are there factors that will affect the behavior of blood or the velocity of the blood or the flow of blood in the arterial tree. There are mainly three factors, and we're going to discuss them one by one. First is the cardiac, and the cardiac is, already we know this, that the cardiac, especially the left ventricle, is the source of the main energy, which is the pressure gradient energy. Pressure gradient, which is starting from the left ventricle and then go through the whole arterial tree. So there is always a pressure gradient, a pressure difference between 2 points along that arterial tree. So the cardiac muscle is the origin of this delta P or the pressure gradient. It's mainly in the ejection phase. You know, the heart the left ventricle is having an ejection phase. We call it the systole. Ejection of blood from the left ventricle through the aorta and then to the main arteries and then the branches of the body. So this is the systolic wave or the systolic component. And then there is another component, another phase of the heart, the cardiac cycle. We call it the filling. Filling means what? The ventricles are dilating to receive the blood. So this is called the diastole. And the diastole, there is no energy coming from the heart, but as we'll see later on, there is another source of energy that will keep the blood flowing during this diastole. So this is the cardiac. The second part or the second factor is as we see here, this is the big and medium arteries. And what are the criteria of these arteries? They are full of, or mainly have abundance of elastin or elastic fibers. And these elastic fibers are giving these arteries a characteristic of compliance. They are compliant arteries. Compliant arteries means what? They can stretch and then recoil back. We'll see this in details soon. And then the third factor are the presence of the arterioles. Arterioles, as we mentioned earlier, they are the very terminal branches of the arterial tree, and they are very small. They are just before the capillaries. And what is the characteristic of these arterioles? That they have the tunica media. They are more contractile. We all know that the big arteries and medium arteries and all other arteries in the arterial tree, they have tunica media, but they are not contractile. They don't respond to contractions or dilation. We have no vasoconstriction, no vasodilation among the big arteries, but we have this criteria very obvious in the arterioles. Arterioles are having contractile, smooth muscle fibers or smooth muscle cells. And these contractions and dilations of these muscle cells in the arterioles, they are capable of controlling blood flow to the tissues based on the demand of this tissue for the blood requirement. and this is called the peripheral resistance. So now we start by the big and medium arteries. We know that the tunica media of these arteries contain muscle fibers, but more important, it contains a lot of elastic fibers, elastin, and other layers in the arteries also contain elastic layers. So this elasticity of these arteries, it gives them a criteria of what we call the Wind-Kessel effect. What is the Wind-Kessel effect? This criteria that allows these arteries to expand during the systolic component and to relax during the diastolic component. So again, we have systole coming from the heart, systolic wave coming from the heart along this arterial tree. As it goes in these medium and big arteries, it make them stretch. So there is here, during the systolic wave, it applies pressure over the waves, over the wall from inside, making them stretching out. So this is the Wind-Kessel, the part of the Wind-Kessel effect that the arteries will get in a dilated part. This is actually what we can feel if you feel the pulse. If somebody is having, you need to take the pulse of this patient, what you need to do, put your fingers over the radial or over the carotid or any arteries in the body, and you can feel this, the expansion and recoil. So this is the Wind-Kessel effect. Again, in the systolic wave, you have what? Expansion. So we have expansion of the arteries. During diastole, what have? We have in diastole, we have no energies coming from the heart. But what happens here? Okay, the energy that is given to the expanded arteries, now it recoils back. When it recoils back, it gives this energy to the blood. So again, the second part of the Wind-Kessel effect that we have during diastole, we have recoil. So systole, we have expansion. Diastole, we have recoil. What is the effect of the recoil? It gives back the energy being obtained during the systolic expansion. It gives it back to the blood. What happened? The blood will continue forward. So what is the driving force during diastole is the recoil of the Wind-Kessel effect. What is the driving force during systole is the contraction of the cardiac muscle. So during systole and diastole, there are energies given to the blood. During systole is the contraction of the heart, the delta P, pressure gradient, and during diastole we have what? We have the recoil of the big and medium arteries. They are giving some energy to the blood to continue flowing during the diastole when we lack arterial contraction, myocardial contraction. Now another thing which we'll discuss here is all these are the energies given to the blood. We know that there is the pressure energy during the systole or the recoil energy during the diastole. But is there anything that will hinder this or face this back? Yes, this is the resistance. We need to know that the arterial tree has some resistance to the flow. This resistance is natural sometimes or pathological in other times. What is the natural thing? We call it the peripheral resistance. And we had touched this when we were discussing the arterioles. We mentioned that the arterioles have capability of the contraction and relaxation, or what we call vasoconstriction and vasodilation. We'll come to this in a moment. So this is a natural peripheral resistance that happens, and it is under control by many factors. But at the end, we know that there is something called the peripheral vasoconstriction and peripheral vasodilation, and this is what we call the peripheral resistance. So peripheral resistance is applied by the arterioles, the natural arterioles of the vascular system. But we have sometimes some pathological resistance, and this is called the stenosis, and you have artery that has pathological narrowing. Again, this is another resistance to the flow. And this resistance is called the stenotic resistance, and we'll come to this when discussing the stenosis as a factor in the resistance to the flow. So as we finish the effect of the recoil and expansion of the big arteries and its effect on the circulation, we need to discuss what is the peripheral resistance. Peripheral resistance, again, is a factor that will affect the circulation. This peripheral resistance is applied by what? The arterioles. Arterioles are capable of having a condition or a status of vasodilation or a status of vasoconstriction. Okay, what happened in vasodilation? Vasodilation, this diagram here is illustration, is providing some insight about the arteries, the arterioles, and the sphincters that will open or constrict. This status here is vasodilation. What happened? These sphincters here along the arterioles will open, providing what? Providing more perfusion of the blood during the capillaries. Through the capillaries, now they have abundance of blood, and they are capable of doing what you call the exchange of nutrients and gases and waste products and all this stuff with the cells. The cells are in these empty spaces here. Then the blood will go back to the venules and then to the venous side. So this is a case of vasodilation. What happened? Resistance drops and more perfusion. We need to know this. During vasodilation part, we have resistance drops, we have low resistance, and we have more perfusion of blood. The second condition or the second status, when we have a status of vasoconstriction, like here. This illustration is showing us what will happen during vasoconstriction. These are the arterioles, and we have the sphincters are closed. What happened? There's reduction of the flow to this area of the tissues. Okay, so the perfusion or the nutrients and oxygen and all these are given to this limited this area will be limited. But what happened here again, we have a higher resistance to the flow. So again, we have with vasoconstriction, we have a higher resistance and we have low perfusion. Accordingly, the veins will drain less blood, as you see here, the small arrow. So again, we have here two conditions of vasoconstriction, vasodilation, and these are applied by the arterioles. So what will happen if I'm having vasodilation? I get what we call here the low resistance flow. So this one here, it gives this. Vasodilation, it gives me low resistance. Vasoconstriction, it gives what? A high resistance. And this is the Doppler waveform with these conditions of vasoconstriction and vasodilation, or what we call low resistance with vasodilation, high resistance with vasoconstriction. Okay, where we can find a status of vasoconstriction or a status of vasodilation. To understand this, we need to know that in our body, we have special organs, we call them vital organs. Vital organs means what? We cannot survive without them. Examine. Okay, examples. We have the brain, we have liver, kidneys, heart, many organs in our body are called vital organs. On the other hand, we have some other organs that we call them non-vital. Okay, like our skeletal muscles, like limbs, upper or lower extremities. Okay, small intestine. These are, we can survive without them, yes. Many people have some accident or whatever, or some surgery, and these parts are removed and nothing wrong there. They can live their life. So again, we have vital and non-vital. Why we need to know this? Because vital organs, their arteries are in a status of vasodilation 24/7. Never, these vital organs never have a status of normally, never to have a status of vasoconstriction. Some pathologies might lead to that, but in natural, normal life, we don't have vasoconstriction or a higher resistance among these organs. Always they are a lower resistance status. So if you scan the arteries to the brain, the arteries to the liver, arteries to the kidney, they are all the time of a low resistance. And we'll discuss this later on. We know what is called the resistive index, right? So we have this, keep this in mind. The second condition, when we have what we call the non-vital organs. Non-vital organs, like mentioned earlier, skeletal muscles, intestine, and other parts of the body, they are non-vital. We can live without, okay? Yes, we might not have an easy life, but still we are alive. So these are non-vital, okay? And what happens in these non-vital organs? These arterioles are, most of the time, they are in a vasoconstriction status, meaning that these organs, if you scan the arteries, their arteries, they will be in a higher resistance condition. So there is a higher resistance status in most of the time, and this is what we call the resting time. resting status or resting time, they are in a condition or in a status of high resistance. Why? The arterioles are, most of the time, they are in a status of vasoconstriction. But what happens if you push these parts to function? For example, our skeletal muscles are all the time in a vasoconstriction. But if you run, you go running or jogging or whatever you exercise, what happens? These arterioles, because of the higher demand of oxygen and nutrients, these arterioles will open. So what will happen? They will go from vasoconstriction to vasodilation. What is the result? The arteries here, if you scan them, they will show a lower resistance status. But this lower resistance status is not the natural or not the permanent condition. It's occasional when we have these organs put in a challenge or put in a work demand. Okay, so another condition, like if you have intestine, you are not eating all the time. When you eat, the intestine will start to function, and then they will open the arterioles, receiving more blood, and the resistance will drop. So now we come to the peripheral resistance evaluation, or how can I evaluate or get in numbers what is the peripheral resistance, and we can calculate this by what we call resistive index, or RI. Everybody hear about RI, and we need to know what is the RI. RI is the resistive index, and it has a formula, and this is the formula. RI equals PSV minus EDV divided by PSV. What is PSV? Peak systolic velocity. This one. This is the systole, and we have here a diastole. So the peak systolic velocity is this part. And then we have the EDV. EDV is end diastolic velocity. So here. So the difference between this is the peak systolic velocity and the end diastolic velocity, the gap or the difference between this is the ratio or the difference between peak systolic and end diastolic velocity. So we have two velocities and we get the difference between them. And this is the difference between the peak systolic and diastolic velocity, this yellow part. Now we come to the ratio, it's comparing to what? This part to the PSV. So the other component of the formula is the PSV here. PSV is what? The peak systolic velocity. So from here to here, this is the peak systolic velocity. So if you have this visual mind, you can compare this compared to this. So this is the resistive index. The lower the end diastolic velocity, the longer the yellow part, and I will get higher RI. So again, RI is the ratio between this to this. Peak systolic minus end diastolic divided by peak systolic. Velocities I'm talking about, okay? So if I'm having the lower end diastolic velocity, it goes down, 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 till almost to the zero line. What will happen? This yellow line, it goes down, 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 almost equal to the peak systolic velocity. So the yellow, if it reaches almost to the red, I will get a higher RI. If the peak systolic, the end diastolic velocity is higher, meaning that this organ is having open the arterioles, what happened? The end diastolic velocity will be higher. I will get this yellow line shorter, and I will get a higher, a lower RI, lower resistive index. All right. So it's higher consumption of blood, lower resistive index. So this is the resistive RI. Again, it's the ratio between peak systolic minus end diastolic divided by peak systolic velocity. So it is a ratio utilized to quantify, meaning that get it in numbers, of the resistance to the flow. So what if the end diastolic velocity, as you mentioned here, it goes to the zero? It goes down here to the zero. What happened? The yellow line will be equal to the red line, and this ratio will be 1. If you remember, we have, if two parts of the ratio are equal to each other, the ratio will go to 1, right? So this is here, Ri will be 1. But our organs, arteries, the resistive index are usually around the 0.7, some ratio between 0.7 and 0.8 depending on the organ, okay? But for example, kidneys are normally 0.7. Liver might be 0.75 or a little bit higher or lower depending on the vitality of the organ. So to continue with the resistance to the flow, we need to discuss a pathology which is called the stenosis, or narrowing of a vessel. This narrowing is usually caused by pathology like plaque, which is the commonest factor, but also might have fibromuscular dysplasia and other pathologies that might lead to stenosis. But not any stenosis, we will call it significant. We have to have something called significant, hemodynamically significant stenosis. What is this hemodynamic significant stenosis? It could be up down to 50% reduction in the diameter or 75% of the cross-sectional area of the vessel. This is what we call significant stenosis. So this is our discussion now. We'll be discussing the significant stenosis. And significant stenosis is known to have what? To have hemodynamics changes and clinical symptoms and signs changes. To discuss this stenosis, we need to divide the area of a stenotic area into 4 segments or 4 areas to discuss. First segment or first area to discuss is this one, the prestenotic area. We will discuss what happens in this prestenotic area. And then we discuss the second area, which is the area of a stenosis itself at stenosis. Also, we will discuss the post-stenotic area, this one. And then we have a distal area, a little far from the stenosis, could be like 10-15 centimeters away from the stenotic area. Okay, we need to know something here, which is called the continuity rule. Continuity rule is what? The volumetric flow rate that goes in segment A or segment B or segment C or segment D, all are the same. This is the continuity rule. It's constant. The volume flow is constant. Is it the same amount of flow before the stenosis? No, this is a little bit reduced amount of flow, but it should be consistent all the time. Why reduced? Remember earlier that we have the Ohm's law or the Poiseuille's law, that we have the Q, the amount of blood flow, equal to what? The delta P over R. Delta P is the pressure gradient and R is the resistance. But since we have stenosis, the resistance is high. What happened to the Q will be reduced. So the whole amount of blood will be reduced, but in the meantime, it should go from area A, B, C, D in the same amount or the same consistent volume flow in all these segments. So this is important to mention, guys, before we go to the details. Now come to the stenosis in the pre-stenotic segment. Okay, some people call it area A. That's fine. So I like it. Area A is the area where the blood is moving just before it hits the stenosis. Most of the times there will be no or little changes in the blood flow here. If you put the Doppler spectral waveform, you will get almost a normal flow because of the stenotic area. Some people, when you have this tight stenosis, so assuming that the stenosis here is too tight, I might have a resistance form or a high resistance form of blood flow by Doppler. You might have here the reflective wave, early diastolic reflection, and you might have low end diastolic velocity. So these are signs that you might have a tight stenosis. It's not all the time, but if it's present, you might expect that this stenosis is too tight. The second area, or the area of a stenosis, people call it area B. So what will happen here in area B? The amount of blood, the Q equals velocity divided by cross-sectional area. Why we need to mention this? Because the Q, which is the blood flow here, it should be the same continuity rule, right? But the area here, the cross-sectional area, is too small. So small cross-sectional area, what happened? I have to have a high velocity to compensate for the cross-sectional area. So in this stenotic area, what will happen? We have a very high velocity. There is increase of the velocity in this area. In the area of a stenosis, we have a higher velocity. Why? To make up for the narrowing of the cross-sectional area. So what happened here? Because of the continuity rule, I have a higher velocity. So What happened again in area B? We have a higher velocity. What else? Because of something called the Bernoulli's principle, I will get also lower pressure. So what will happen with in segment B or stenotic area? I will have a high velocity and lower pressure. Why we have a lower pressure? As we mentioned earlier, we have a high velocity. It requires a higher kinetic energy. Higher kinetic energy is taken from what? From the pressure energy. So what happened? Higher velocity, higher kinetic energy, lower pressure, because kinetic energy is taken from the pressure segment or the pressure energy. So what happened now? I will get a lower pressure with higher velocity. And this is called Bernoulli's principle. All right. So again, at the narrowest point in the vessel, which is the stenosis, the velocity is highest and the pressure is the lowest. This is something that we need to memorize. At the narrowest segment here, we have the velocity, the highest velocity, peak systolic velocity. You see here is very high, but in the meantime, the pressure drops, and there is the pressure here is the lowest along the whole vascular segment. So based on Poiseuille's law, we mentioned that Poiseuille's law equals what? Delta P equals Q multiplied by 8 multiplied by the length of the vessel, and this Poise, which is the viscosity, divided by pi, which is 3.14, divided by r to the raised to the fourth power. Okay, so according to this, if I put Q as a volume here, it equals to what? Delta P times pi times r raised to the fourth power divided by 8 times L times Poise. Okay, what is the significance of this? Its significance is what? When we have the diameter of the vessel, for example, I'm assuming that it will be halved. I'm having here R is halved. What will happen to the amount of flow? Okay, this will be reduced by how much? 16 times. Why? Because this is half times half times half times half, which is 1 over 16. So the amount of the volume flow would be 1 over 16 of its original volume. Okay, this is something you need to know, put in our mind also. So in a significant stenosis, like I mentioned earlier, that we have the diameter reduction 50%. What will happen here? The amount of flow in this system will be reduced 16 times. So it will be 1 over 16 of its original flow. Again, repeat this one more time. When a significant stenosis, when we have the radius of the artery is halved, which is 50% diameter reduction, all right? What will happen to the amount of blood? Q, the amount of blood that can be provided by this vessel that has significant stenosis. What will happen to the blood flow? It will be reduced down to 1 over 16 of its original flow that was before the stenosis. This will end up by what? It might end by some ischemia to the tissues, and ischemia will trigger vasodilation of the arterioles, and this might have, vasodilation might have lower resistance in the peripheral resistance. Peripheral resistance might be dropped to allow whatever blood comes will have no more resistance. So the resistance only that happened in the stenosis, but the peripheral resistance in these cases might be dropped down. So as we finish area B, which is the stenosis, and we mentioned here, what will happen? We will have diameter reduction, and if this diameter reduction is 50%, we get significant stenosis, and significant stenosis will have more reduction of the volume of blood flow. What happened next to the stenosis? We have what we call area C, or post-stenotic turbulence. Post-stenotic turbulence. What happened here? Because of the sudden change in the diameter now becomes wider. So there is increase in the diameter, and because of the high velocity, the blood is coming from the stenotic area with high velocity. So there are two factors that will increase the Reynolds number. What are these factors? Again, diameter increase, velocity increase. What will happen? I will get a higher Reynolds number, more than 2000, and this will be reflected as turbulent flow. Turbulent flow in color, it gives me what we call the mosaic shape or the mosaic appearance, areas of red and blue all over, okay? Or in the waveform, we get what we call spectral broadening. And this is here a simple diagrammatic representation of the filling of the spectral broadening or filling of the window here. And sometimes we might get what we call systolic reversal. During systolic flow, there is a reversal of the flow here. You see here, some blood is reversing back. So we get here systolic reversal and filling of the window or spectral broadening. So now we come to the area D, or the distal to the stenosis, this part. What will happen here? To understand this, we need to go to the stenotic area. We need to understand that there is a substantial loss of energy. Many energy, or big part of the energy, is consumed here. Why? There is frictional loss. Of course, we know that the surface of the stenosis is not smooth, so there is frictional loss. But also, there is what we call inertial losses. Why inertial loss? There is sudden change in the velocity, as we see here. A lot of velocity that happen here, a higher velocity, sudden change of the velocity. This is another factor of the inertial loss. We might have change in direction, which will add to the inertial losses. You see the blood's moving this way, and then change direction and change in the velocity. Again, the sudden change in the diameter. All these will lead to what we call inertial losses. This inertial loss, what happened? Inertial loss plus frictional loss. At the end, I will get lower energy that is still available for the blood to move. And this lower energy will end up by what we call here the area of distal to the stenosis, and we call this Tardus Parvus. So let's understand what is Tardus Parvus. Because of the lower energy, the blood is moving. To reach to the peak systolic velocity, it takes a long time. So the kickoff, or the reaching to the peak systolic velocity, it takes a while, and that's why we call it retarded or delayed. So there is delay of takeoff. Again, this one thing. Second thing, we have the peak systolic velocity is lowered, is not that high. Why? Because we have lower energy provided. Why lower energy? Because big part of the energy is consumed in the stenotic and post-stenotic area here. So at the end, what we'll get here, area D, is Tardus Parvus. Tardus Parvus, delayed and low velocity. So in the presence of significant stenosis, we might here need to understand some events or some consequences. What will happen in the flow? Number one, we get a higher velocity. Number two, we might get post-stenotic turbulence. Number three, we might get pressure gradient across the stenosis. This is building of a pressure gradient, because the pressure at the end of the stenosis will be much lower than the pressure at the beginning of the stenosis. And we mentioned why, because of a lot of energy losses. There is lower pulsatility of the flow. The flow will become less pulsatile. Why? The peak systolic velocity will get lower. And again, I will get lower volume delivered to the tissues, as we mentioned earlier, because we're having a higher resistance that will lower the pressure, the Q, the amount of blood flow. And then at the end, we might get, if you have a long-standing stenosis, I might get what we call collaterals, building up of collaterals. So these are here the collaterals, the phenomena that might happen. It's not all the time. You see it mostly when you have long-standing stenosis. What happened? As any artery in the body, it has some branches. These branches are very minute. They are small branches that are providing some nutrition to the tissues around the path of the artery. These small branches here, whenever there is stenosis at this segment, for example, the blood flow is moving in this direction. what will happen? It will go to these small branches just before the area of stenosis, trying to find a way out. And these small vessels, we know that they are having very minute network. So this network will start to open. And this will call this, we call it collateral. So what happened again? The blood is moving this way, will go through these small branches, and it will open them up, and will continue with the other branches, and then return back to the original blood flow. This building of these dilated vessels here around the area of stenosis, we call these collaterals. So these collaterals, are they beneficial? Yes, they are beneficial because they are providing some sort of uh, like detour of the blood around the stenotic area. So it has some flow back to the artery, but of course it's not that helpful compared to the original artery. So they are providing some help, okay, and this some help will be good for the resting conditions. So the patient is not, for example, a limb or whatever is not having extra work. That will be enough. For example, the heart, it has some collaterals, sometimes it happens, and these collaterals are good for the heart during the rest conditions. But this patient, if they have a stenotic area, even they have collaterals, the collaterals will not help if this patient goes in a strenuous work or a lot of exercise or has to have a lot of blood requirement. What will happen? The heart will beat faster, and then this patient might get a heart attack. So collaterals are helpful, yes, but not as helpful as a patent or open vessel. So now few words about the Bernoullis effect and about the Bernoullis equation. Bernoullis effect is depending on, or is an example of what we call the law of conservation of energy, or the law of energy conservation. This law is a universal law. It applies for a lot of factors, a lot of energies, a lot of equations along the whole universe. It states that what? Energy is, as you see here, energy is neither created nor destroyed, doesn't vanish. Energy is there all the time, but it might change its condition. So its expression might have energy expressed as pressure, or as kinetic, or heat, or light, or electricity. All these are expressions of energy. So we have here what? Energy can be converted from one form to another, but it will never be destroyed. This is a universal law, and it will apply to a lot of factors in our living. So Bernoulli's effect is an example of this law. How is that? We know that the pressure energy and the kinetic energy both together is a constant. So pressure energy and kinetic energy both together, the addition is constant. So all the time, these together will be constant. What happens now in Bernoulli's effect? So at the stenotic area, what we'll have? We'll have a higher velocity that requires more kinetic energy, and more kinetic energy as is derived from the pressure energy. What happened? The pressure energy now drops. At the stenosis area, again, what we'll have? We'll have a higher velocity and lower pressure. Higher velocity, lower pressure. So this pressure drop can be calculated based on Bernoulli's effect. Yes, as we mentioned earlier, we have high velocity, I will get pressure drop. So can we calculate it? Yes, there is a formula for Bernoulli's effect that is easy to apply on hemodynamics. We need to know that Bernoulli's effect is not only applied in hemodynamics, it's applied in hydrodynamics, it's applied in air dynamics. It has a lot of applications in science. But for the hemodynamics, there is a simplified formula. And this formula says that delta P, which is the pressure gradient or the pressure drop, equals 4 multiplied by the V square. V is the velocity. So example, if I'm having the velocity is 3 meters per second, we use the unit meter per second, not centimeter per second. 3 meter per second, okay, which is equal to 300 centimeter per second. But if you apply to this formula, we use the meter per second unit for the velocity, okay. So then the pressure drop equals what? Equals 4 multiplied by 3 square, okay. 4 multiplied by 3 square means what? 3 times 3, or 3 multiplied by itself 2 times. The result will be 36 millimeter mercury. So the difference between the pressure before the stenosis and after the stenosis, including the pressure drop, it will be what? 36 millimeter mercury drop. Okay, there is something called Venturi effect. It's very close to the Bernoullis effect. I just need to mention it here because just in case if you hear about the Venturi effect, it's very close to the Bernoullis effect. Okay, it states that reduction in the fluid pressure that results when the fluid flows through a constricted section or constricted segment. Okay, so this is the Venturi's effect, just in case if you want to know it. Thank you guys, and I hope that was beneficial, and see you soon in the hemodynamics of the veins or venous hemodynamics. Good luck.